This is a 2011 Porsche 911 Speedster, and it is the rarest 911 that you probably don't know about. Everyone knows the GT3 and the GT3 RS and the GT2, but this is rarer than any of those. And today, I'm going to show you around it. I've borrowed this Speedster from CNC Motors here in Southern California, which is basically the dealer with the most vast and wild array of crazy and exotic cars. If it's exotic and if it exists, CNC seems to have it. And that's why they have this. The 2011 911 Speedster comes from the 997 generation, and Porsche only made 356 of these for the entire world, which makes this the single rarest 997 model. As a result, this car is worth big money today. This is a very well-preserved example with around 1,500 miles, and CNC has it listed for just under $300,000. Today, I'm going to take you on a tour of it and show you why it's special, and then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. Now, because this is a Speedster, we first must start with the roof. I say that because the Speedster name has kind of a tradition in the Porsche world, dating all the way back to the original 356 Speedster in the 1950s. It was sort of a lower, sleeker 356 with a lower windshield and kind of a smaller convertible top. Porsche continued the tradition in the 1980s with the original 911 Speedster. They brought that back in the 90s for another 911 Speedster. And then in 2011, they came out with this, which is basically a regular 911 with a bunch of changes to make it a little bit more special and continue the Speedster heritage. And so we start back here. Instead of the usual convertible top that comes down in the back and two rear seats, the Speedster has this cool double bubble line behind the seats that just makes it look a lot more exciting and different than a regular 911. But it wasn't just the look of the roof when it was open that made this car different from a regular 911. It was also the operation. Now, a regular 911 from this era, you just pulled a little button and the top closed automatically. In this thing, you pull a little button in the center console marked open, and this is all that happens. The rear deck lid comes up just a little bit. Then it's up to you to move the deck lid out of the way, and then from there, you have to manually put the top up or down. I'm not going to go through the whole process, but you get the idea. Now, if you think this seems absolutely ludicrous in a car that is this expensive, $300,000, these were like $150 new, you're correct. It is very unusual, but that was kind of the point of the Speedster. It had like a compromised top because you weren't supposed to really use it. You were just supposed to look cool in your double bubble rear end special 911. One interesting quirk worth noting while the top is in this position, you had to remove these little plastic panels behind the seats in order to get the top to go all the way up. And instead of just having you throw them in the interior where they would just look ugly and unfinished, Porsche actually has these little bags in the back behind the seats where you can place them when you have to remove them in order to get the top up. That is typical Germans thinking through every little detail, but it's a nice little quirk. Now, when you were finished putting the top up or down or whatever you wanted to do, you simply finished it the same way that you started it by manually putting the deck lid back into place behind the seats. And then by going back into the interior and pressing the close button, it simply tightened around the deck lid and then it was closed again and the top was up or down or whatever you needed it to be. But the roof wasn't the only thing that made the 911 Speedster interesting. There were several other unusual quirks that separated this car from a regular 997. Chief among them was the windshield. This is the regular 997 windshield, except it isn't. It has the same angle, but it stops short. The 997's windshield was a couple of extra inches. The Speedster's windshield was lower, as it had been in all previous Speedster models, in order to make it seem sleeker, more exotic, more special. After all, this car was about driving around with the top down. It was originally intended for the West Coast, the American market, where people would have the top down all the time. And this kind of carries on that theme with sort of a smaller windshield and a top that you won't really fiddle with unless you absolutely have to. And the windshield wasn't the 997 Speedster's only glass-related quirk. there's actually another one on the side of the car. Now, the window in the door that goes up and down, that was a fairly normal window. It was a little smaller than the one in the 997 to account for the lower and smaller roof. But when the roof is in place, there's still a hole back here behind the window. Now, in the regular 997, that hole was pretty big, and so there was a rather large window there, but in the Speedster, the hole is very small, and so check this out. There's a very tiny little rear quarter window back there that you probably would never even notice. My favorite thing about that window, though, is how it goes up. Take a look at this. It sort of like rotates on an axis. It is a very cool little quirky, tiny little window necessitated because of this car's rather weird top. Now, beyond all the roof and humps and glass stuff that this car had, there were also a couple of other interesting quirks about the Speedster. One is the area behind the front seats. Now, like I mentioned before, there are no rear seats, which is unusual in a 911, especially in a 911 convertible. They almost all have back seats, but this one doesn't. And Porsche wanted to make that very, very clear, and they did so by putting a little decal behind the front seat that says, "The area behind the seats is not intended for passengers. Never allow anyone to sit in this area." Never mind that it clearly doesn't look like a seat and has no seatbelt, Porsche wanted to make it very clear so you didn't accidentally confuse this car with one of your other 911s. Other interesting quirks about the 997 Speedster, Porsche only sold about 100 of these in the United States, and there were only 2 colors you could choose from. You could get either white or blue, although there were also a very limited number of paint-to-sample 997 Speedsters in whatever color the person buying it specified. I imagine those are the ones worth the most. Now, obviously, this one is white, and it has a matching white interior. You can see the little white checker pattern on the seats, and there's white in a lot of other places, too, around the climate control vents, on the door panels, on the seats. If you got a blue car, you could option all those things to be blue. You could have blue checkers, blue climate control vents, blue door panel. But you could also choose, if you wanted, to just have all that stuff be black and have it look a little bit more like a regular 911 and not overrun with your exterior color. Another interesting item in the 997 Speedster, they were all individually numbered, telling you exactly which number your car was out of the global run of 356. This one, as you can see on the little plaque on the glove box, is number 256. Now, more interesting than that, though, is the door sill. Take a look at this. It also says what number Speedster you have, and it's not like it was just kind of etched in there. They had to make an individual door sill for every Speedster, and that looks really, really high quality. I love the look of that. And 2 other interesting and cool quirks worth noting on the 997 Speedster. One is this little black panel back here. Now, on most 911s from this era, there was a piece of clear film placed right here on the fender so that when the front wheels would kick rocks back and hit the fender, they wouldn't damage it. But on this car, instead of making the film clear, they made it black, which was intended to evoke the look of the 1980s 911s, and specifically the 1980s Speedster, which also had a little black piece there. And frankly, I think it looks really cool. And speaking of evoking a look of previous 911s, the wheels. These wheels were intended to resemble the old Fuchs-style wheels of 911s from the 1970s and 1980s. For the 997 model, they were only offered on the Speedster. You could go to your dealer and order them as special accessories on other models, but the Speedster came with them standard, and they were the only car to do so. And frankly, I think between the wheels and this black panel and the whole general look of the car, this is a really cool looking car. Finally, the last interesting item with the 997 Speedster is under here. This is obviously the engine. Now, the regular 997 911 from this era, the base model, I think had like 345 horsepower. The Carrera S had 385 horsepower. The Speedster borrowed its engine from the GTS model, which had 408 horsepower. So this was 408 horses, but unfortunately it was only mated to PDK. You couldn't get a Speedster with a manual transmission. Now, I will say one interesting thing about the engine. It says in here, Porsche exclusive power kit. That's because it was a power kit over the S engine to bring it to the 408 horsepower, hence that little plaque. All right, and with that, it is time to drive the 997 Speedster. Now, this car has kind of a quirky little thing with the top and all the other little changes they made to make it cool, but at the end of the day, it kind of drives like a 997 Carrera GTS with a convertible top. Not that that's a bad thing. The second generation of the 997 was a fantastic car. A lot of people prefer manual to PDK, and I get that, but the PDK is really quick. It was very robust. They were very reliable units. It shifts very fast. The sound is good, and with the Speedster top, you get to hear it all. And of course, the 997, unlike kind of the 991, the 997 just feels a little bit smaller and a little bit more nimble and maneuverable. The 911 loses a little more of that with every generation. PDK is great, and even by the standards of now, it still feels like a great quick shifting transmission. The interior of this car isn't wonderful. The materials are not just like the most amazing, but they're very functional. Everything works like it should. Everything is placed where you'd expect it, just like you get in Porsches. That's kind of their thing. They're more about function than appearance. In terms of acceleration, this car is reasonably quick. Even a base 997 to me always felt pretty quick, but then you stepped up to the S, you got more power, 385, and then you stepped up to this, you got 405, which was actually a pretty healthy figure. Truthfully, there's nothing bad to say about the driving experience of this car, other than you can get a similar driving experience if you pay a third of the money and get a regular GTS. The difference, of course, is you don't get this ultra rare, limited, low numbered Porsche, and numbered Porsche limited models are super popular right now. And the driving experience really is wonderful. And frankly, looking at the car from the outside, it's a beautiful car. It would be annoying to deal with the top and manually putting up and latching it, but I think that most people who have these, they only take it out when it's a nice day, and they just have it down. And so that's the 2011 Porsche 911 Speedster. While Porsche was busy building the crazy track-focused GT3 and the GT3 RS 4.0 and the Cayman R and the Boxster Spider, they were also building this, one of the quirkiest 911s ever. And now it's time to give it a Doug score. And the Doug score is 60 out of 100. I don't really have a lot of other cars to compare it to, but here it is next to the 997 Turbo and the 911R. The 997 Turbo beats it out overall because it's more practical, faster, and way cheaper, but the Speedster is sure to be worth a lot more in the long run.